Let me see if I can get this story straight now. If I recall, the last place I was talking was about the cold drinks we got at our store, and they came out with something called, well, it had the word champagne in it. We were anxious to try it and spread around the carrier pretty good. A black boy came in. He had heard about the drink, but hadn't got the right word for it straight. And so Miss Howler said, "Can I help you?" He said, "Yes, I want one of them shampoo drinks." We we remember a lot about Mr. Howler. He was the only one that had the telephone. And if he got a telegram, then he took the telegram in his T-model. He had a T-model with the top that would go down, and it had, I think, 28 horsepower, and 20 of the horses were dead, and it went put. Well, Mother always had a real horror of hearing that sound, put, especially because so many of the brothers were in the service and the war was on, and we weren't sure where Carl was alive or dead. We did receive a card saying he was missing in action. Many of us gave him up for dead because there's so few survived in Corregidor. They were defending Corregidor in the Philippines when the Japanese came with such a unbearable assault that they killed so many Marines and soldiers and captured the others. But one Christmas Eve, we heard that put, and Mother was braced for the worst and was praying he didn't turn in our drive, but he did turn in our drive. Put. And she could hardly hold the telegram. And the telegram was short, and this was the message: "Your son Carl is alive and is a prisoner of the Japanese." Well, no one could have bought Mother a gift. No news would have made her happier than to know she, in her intuition, was right all the time. Carl was alive. I remember how sad she was when we had too much milk. We were milking 2 cows at that time, even though we sold milk to Dr. Horn, and we had plenty of milk drinkers at our house. Not just the milk, but setting a churn with plenty of cream in it on the end of the stove until it got warm and clabbered and churn. One of my jobs was to churn, and I was an expert at it. If the clabber and the churn was just right, I timed it, I could make the butter in 5 minutes. And Mother had a nice wood mold, and she'd put that in the mold, salt it and put it in the mold, and then drop it out and wrap it in wax paper. But getting back to this story about Howler and his put, still Mother had a horror every time she heard that sound coming down the road, thinking it was bad news. Quite often, when we're anticipating news, we usually anticipate bad news. But we have good news. It's about as frequent, maybe more frequent than we have bad news. We got to ride on that T-model to Boley. Boley was a long walk. Of course, it was always a long, hot walk because we'd swim. It was a wonderful swimming hole, and it was worth the walk. And we usually didn't have to walk alone. We had friends or family members that walked to the creek. But when you got there, you were so tired and so hot, and the water looked so refreshing, the sandbar and the clear water, but it was freezing cold, and some were reluctant and sat a long time before they would get into the icy water. But once you were in the water, oh, you forgot about all that. Uh, the Howlers had a daughter named Marydale. I believe that was their only child. They were very protective of Marydale. Marydale, as I recall, uh, married a Carmichael, and something happened to their marriage. I don't know what. So most of those years that I knew the Carmichael children and Marydale, she was a grass widow. Uh, and sometimes she had company, and sometimes more than one at a time. And it was noted by the neighbors that sometimes Pansy Howler would come charging off the hill, just down the hill where Marydale lived, shooting a pistol in the air to scare off anybody who might be molesting Marydale. We, it was always good for a ride back from the creek, because usually someone came to the creek before dark. They came to swim, and sometimes they came just to take a good bath. And whoever it was, if we were there, we could pretty well beg a ride home with them, and especially Marydale. We had no problem of getting on that T model. The problem was too many got on the T model, and it was not a very fast car, and it didn't have a lot of power. So when we started up the other side of Stafford's Hill, which, by the way, was the highest hill in our part of the woods, it wouldn't make it up the hill with that load, and so wasn't going fast enough anyhow. We'd jump off and run along, and some of us would give it a little push and get it on up the hill. The story that someone was telling about Pansy Howler. Pansy Howler was not real attractive, but there was some talk about her and Og Gerald having some kind of relationship. Maybe it was based on a friendship or a willingness of Pansy to read the mail that Og Gerald had. Og Gerald had also a lot of boys in service, and he couldn't read, and so when he got a letter, he'd get Pansy to read it for him. One of the letters got into circulation. I think the boy was named Fitzgerald, and Foots was named that because he had a foot that was about size 15 or 16. There was a break-in one time at Tress's store, and that was exciting, a burglary in our town. And the window was broken out, and some of the food stuff was stolen, maybe some of the money. And in investigating the crime, they had spilled a bag of sugar, and the bag of sugar had an imprint of a foot about size 16. And so Fitzgerald was fingered for that crime, and his defense was, how could you convict anyone with a footprint, because there are a lot of folks that besides me that have big feet. But when Foots got in the Army, somehow he got a hold of a typewriter, and he typed his letters. They were not very long, and were not many words spelled correctly. But he did have a PS at the bottom of one that got circulated around the carrier, and the PS said, "Dear censors, if you have to cut out any of this letter, please send it back to me. I had too much trouble typing it to waste any of it." The Howlers were kind of a fixture. That was halfway to downtown. When you got to Howler's, you were about halfway. Right next to Howler's was Dr. Horn's office. Just all kind of stories about Dr. Horn, how he got the carrier, how sometime in the past he'd served time, and while he was serving time, he studied to be a doctor, and I don't know how he ever got the license to be a doctor, but we all thought a lot of him. He was the best doctor we had. He was the only doctor we had. He too was kind of eccentric, kind of short-tempered. He didn't come to church much. I think he may have been something else, a Methodist, Presbyterian, but he'd come during revivals. One revival we had in the wintertime, and it was stifling hot. We had just installed butane in the church. We took out the big pot-bellied heater, and they took advantage of those butane heaters and had the church heated about 92 degrees. Well, Dr. Horn was an advocate of fresh air. When he made house calls and the house was stuffy, the first thing he did was to go around physically and raise every window that he could get up. And so he sat there politely until he couldn't stand it anymore, and there was a big Emerson fan on both sides of the church, and he was under it, so he almost broke up the service by standing and turning on that big fan in the middle of the winter. Dr. Horn had a nurse named Miss Smith, and she went with him everywhere. And Miss Smith probably got a little more proficient in medicine than he did. And so often, if Dr. Horn wasn't in, we were pleased to have Miss Smith to work on us. Dr. Horn, back in the early part of the war, before the war, he had one of Vic's boys was named Sylvester. Sylvester was his chauffeur. But then when Sylvester went off to war, Dr. Horn needed someone to drive him. And Ray was, I don't know, he was probably 14, but he might tell everybody he was 6 years old because he had a way of running back to time when he started his career in the pickle factory and on the highway across from the service station on Highway 11, where he just declared that he was the bookkeeper at a pickle factory when he was 8 years old. Well, he must have been a little older than that when he started driving. Now, Dr. Horn, when he drove himself, he was hard of hearing, and so he gunned it, raced the motor loud enough so he could hear it before he clunked it in gear and then jumped off with a start. But Ray was his chauffeur, and that was quite a feat for him. But Dr. Horn would doctor you for about anything. I remember he came to our house, and our mother had stepped on a nail, a rusty nail, out by the hog pen, and her foot swelled up, and she got fever and got real sick. And Dr. Horn diagnosed that as being I don't know, remember, a terrible disease, smallpox or something. So he gave her a shot, and he gave all of us a shot to keep us from contacting it. And the shots were terrible shots, and the ones he gave Mother was terrible. But they did the work, and even though her foot was infected and looked like gangrene had set in, she saved her foot. And we laid that to Dr. Horn. I was always enjoying being sick. I wasn't sick much. None of us were sick much. But when you're sick, people were kind to you. And so when I felt a sickness coming on, I made the most of it, even though it meant a trip to Dr. Horn and some medicine that always tasted bad. At least you got a little more attention from the family. We had a cousin named D.L. D.L. Pearson. Uncle Dallas had three boys, Lemuel and Malcolm and the one I just mentioned that I've already forgotten, D.L. D.L. Told about when he was growing up, Dr. Horn diagnosed a rare sickness he had and gently told the family that it was fatal and he was going to die. And so the family got real concerned that D.L.'s going to die, and so they let him drop out of school and bought him a billy goat and a wagon and gave him all the honors of being not long for this world. He had, must have been a kidney infection or something was wrong with his kidneys, so every time he went to town or Carrera, he had to drop off a specimen for Dr. Horn to test. And he said, I got tired of peeing in the bottle, and so he said I would set bottles all around and let my sister or my brother or my mama or somebody do their peeing in the bottle, and so he said he'd swap the bottles out that way sometime, which might have been a yarn. But the biggest tale he told was being there one day when a black boy was there to give a kidney specimen, and Dr. Horn said, son, urinate in that bottle over on the table there. And he says, sir, he said, urinate in the bottle. You see the bottle? Urinate in it. He says, I don't know what you're talking about, doctor. He said, well, what I mean, boy, pee in that bottle over there. He said, oh, yes, sir. And he was standing at least 12 feet away. He said, yes, sir. From here? I think that's another one of D.L.'s tales, but I found a lot of humor in it. We all had Dr. Horn deliver, most of us. He delivered me, and he delivered about 10. I don't know if he delivered us all. I can't say that. But one time, the tax assessor was coming around, and Dr. Horn's car was there, and he later learned that Mother's having a baby. And next time he came, Dr. Horn's car was there, and somebody Mother's having another baby. And so the tax assessor, he said, I give up. Every time I try to check on the taxes, Lula's having a baby. And Professor Powell had a little bit to say, too, about our big family when he'd give our diploma at high school. And he got down to Bedloo or me, and he said, the Holloway family has provided a graduate from our school almost every year for the years that I've been here. The soldiers who came home was always soldiers getting off the train or getting on the train. Vic and Mother was across the back fence visiting, talking about their boys, and of course they had to talk about their girls too, because Daphne was a whack. And they told where the boys were and what letters they'd got from them and how they were doing. And then in the conversation, Vic Whitehead said, Miss Holloway, every time a soldier comes to Carrier, folks say that he's either a Holloway or a Whitehead. Well, each of them had at least 6 soldiers in the Army or Navy or Marines or WACs. They had a grandmother that lived with Vic. Vic had 14 children. And a grandmother lived, I can't remember her name right now, but I remember talking to her. She was a daughter of a slave, and she'd talk a little bit about that. But the thing that always intrigued me was, the word was, she was 114 years old. 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 114 Well, after all the children Vic had, and after her husband died, uh, she lost a foot somehow, probably diabetes. And with that one foot, she's able to get around good enough to find her a husband. And she married Kit Nixon. And Kit Nixon was probably the biggest, strongest black in Carrier. Also a very hard worker and very easygoing. He lived in a little house back of Uncle Arthur. If we had any heavy work to do, Daddy would get Kit Nixon to do that. But it was a surprise to some of us. Kit may have been half the age of Victoria. But Victoria and Kit got married, and they must have been happy. They didn't have a car. They rode in a horse and wagon, and they sat together, and both of them looked very happy in those days that they lived together as husband and wife. The blacks that lived between the Whiteheads and us were Coopers. And Sis worked for Mother some ironing, especially when Mother'd have a baby. She'd get Sis to come and work. Uh, their house was little, but it was always very clean. They didn't have any grass in the yard. They swept the yard with a broom sage, which wasn't unusual in those days. Quite a few people didn't have grass in the yard. A lot of them would haul creek sand and spread that over the barren ground, and then they would clean the yard by sweeping it with broom sage. Now, you don't know what broom sage is. That's a bush that grows up about head high, and you can cut them easy and bind them together with a rag and use them to make a broom. I remember they had a kumquat tree. A kumquat tree always intrigued me. That's the one, has a skin on it and a lot of little seed-like fruits on the inside. I'd like to talk now some about our friends that lived right next door, the Spearses. Pascal was a daddy and Katrina was a mother, and the three boys were Larry, Harry, Jean, and Wendell. Well, it better not leave out Maureen. She came along a lot later, like my sister Shirley came along a lot later. They, by the way, became lifelong friends. But I remember they spoiled Maureen so greatly that they were always taking up for her and always making a little princess out of her. And she took advantage of it. I remember one time she started screaming like a banshee, and her mother came to see what was wrong. She said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Dale won't let me stick him with this pen." Well, when we asked Wendell what they named the baby sister, he says, "Well, we're thinking about this and we're thinking about that. And I think we're going to call her Fiddlesticks." But I guess they decided Maureen was a better name. Pascal was a craftsman. He could work on engines. He could do anything with lumber. He worked somewhere in a fence job, I think, and he had a nice car. On the way home, must have had a head-on, totaled the car. And so they bought a model, and Pascal cut the back off of it and made a truck bed. And it was very, very well done. It almost looked like an open station wagon with sides open. And it also had slow speed and a lot of coughing, and we called it the Hoopy Cat. And it went pretty slow, and we liked to jump off the back and hang on to one of the posts and run along beside it, and then after a while jump back on. This was my main transportation to church in the teenage years or preteen, because Pascal was very faithful in going to church, especially after Clyde Gordon left and we got a new preacher named C.G. Wells. They became real close friends, and Pascal and Uncle Arthur and maybe a few others would stop at Brother Wells' house, the pastorium, and drink coffee after church. And it didn't bother me that I was getting home an hour later, or gave us more time to play around. And he also, on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, would take us to the creek. And so we had a ride to the creek and back from the creek. And I wondered always why he waited till 4 o'clock. Well, he's like me. He likes to get out in the hot sun a little bit later in the afternoon. They had a horse. It was a real good plow horse, and I was envious of Larry, because Larry learned to plow when he was about 8, and it was a joy to watch him plow such a straight furrow and watch the big old turning plow turn over the black ground and watch him turn around. One day, the mare had a colt, and somehow somebody was bothering the colt, or the colt was calling for his mama, and that horse jumped over the fence with the plow still attached to her. Of course, the plow didn't go over the fence. We noted that Pascal was also a good farmer. They always had a good crop of corn. They used to feed the chickens and the horse. Our farming wasn't quite so successful. We were not very good at chopping out the nut grass and the Johnson grass, but we did. We made a crop of sugar cane. We made enough sugar cane to load up and take to Uncle Andrew's. Uncle Andrew, who lived on the home place, which was our grandparents on the Holloway side, he had a cane mill, and we'd go out to take the cane, and they'd turn the cane into syrup. It was interesting how the cane mill worked. It had 3 big iron pressing wheels and setting upright, and with a long pole, and they'd hitch a mule to the long pole, and one man would stand at the pile of cane, and he would stick, the cane was cut at an angle, he'd just stick it in between 2 of the 3 crushers, and it would crush out the cane, and it would fall into a container, and the container then would pour into an open 55-gallon barrel. 55-gallon barrel of cane juice then would be poured in a long pan, and the pan was sitting on some brickwork that had a place underneath that you could keep stoking with wood, and it boiled the syrup. It boiled the cane juice, and those that made syrup knew just how long to boil it until the consistency changed from cane juice to syrup, and then they dipped up the syrup and put it in shiny new gallon buckets with a tight lid and a bale to carry it. And I can remember us getting the syrup after it'd been made and carrying it to a little barn that Daddy made. Our barn wasn't very big, and that's where we stored the syrup. And I counted. I wasn't doing all the toting, but I was doing the counting, and I counted 55 2-gallon buckets of syrup. Now, all of us weren't home at any one time. I suppose at that time we had 6 or 7 plus Mother and Daddy. And I recall when it came time to make syrup again, we would either be completely out of syrup or down to the last 2 or 3 buckets. So our family ate more than 50 gallons of syrup. Can you remember, you that are listening to this, if you haven't drank cold sugarcane juice, there is nothing, or at that time, there was nothing that I thought tasted better than cold sugarcane juice. On our return to Kansas, and I'll get into that sometime, how in the world we got from Carrier to Kansas. But on the way back, we stopped at a place, I guess it was close to Columbia, Mississippi, where a man had an operation of making syrup. And he had big signs, free cane juice. So he had a lot of people stop. And he just liked to tell you about the whole operation. He had a dirty white shirt. He went in a little bow tie. He was an expert on syrup making, and he enjoyed telling all the Yankees going back home just how to do this. Of course, his object was to sell some syrup. He not only let you taste the syrup, but he would fill up a cup and let you drink the cane juice. Well, I recall that I remember how good it was, and so I bought 2 gallons of cane juice and 1 gallon of syrup. We took that to Kansas, and we had when we got back, it was between Christmas and New Year's, and for New Year's we were going to have whatever they call it on New Year's Eve, where you meet together, a watch night, I believe is what we called it. And we had just moved into a little bitty new house, but we were so proud of it. It had a basement, and we were going to show off our house, and we were going to have the party, and we were going to serve something many of them had never had, was cane juice. Well, we didn't recognize the fact that it was a couple of days before we got the cane juice back to Kansas and in the refrigerator. And so when the people started drinking the cane juice, the more they drank, the happier they got. The cane juice had fermented, and we had a bunch of Baptists that were feeling real good by drinking fermented cane juice. I could have lost my church, but they were understanding and maybe appreciative. Well, we ramble. That's the way this tape's going to be. You know, keep on reminiscing and trying to put a lot of past on tape, and the trails lead in all directions. I remember learning to swim. Some of the boys learn to swim dog paddle. That means you lay out on the water, you keep your head above the water, and you work your feet and your hands. And one of the baptizings, we had some big baptizings after a revival. We had a special place for baptism, and that one was on, I believe it was on the Upper Bowley. We call it Upper and Lower because the road crosses the creek in about 2-3 miles apart. And on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, the church, and sometimes be more than one church because sometimes our pastor was serving more than one church, and so sometimes they'd put the candidates together. And I can remember photographers. In fact, we have somewhere, I wish I had the picture of the baptizing, and I believe I counted about 40. And that's a pretty big revival when they have that many to baptize. But I remember the preacher usually had some assistants. He usually had two deacons with him, and I remember our deacon brother Pearson quite often was one of the baptizing assistants. They tell about Keith when he was baptized. You stood in line. It was a kind of a frightening thing, you know, to go under the water, especially if you've never been under the water. And the long line just started and waded out to the preacher, and the rest of them ran along single line. And then when it came your turn, you waded out into the water about waist deep, and they baptized you, and two of the assistants helped you get back up the bank. They say, of course I didn't know it, but it's a story. Keith had just learned to dog paddle, to swim, and he lingered back so there'd be a good distance between him and the preacher. And when he got his turn, he dog paddled before everybody, before that big audience, as he approached the preacher. I don't suppose that interfered with the value of the baptism at all. I recall that we would sing on the sandbar by the baptismal place. We would sing especially on Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wistful eye. And another one we sing was, shall we gather at the river? Well, we were in, someone would have a long prayer before we started, and during the middle of a long prayer, a snake began to swim right across the baptizing place. And I remember Buddy Spears. Harv and Janie raised Buddy Spears. He wasn't their child, but they raised him as their son. And Buddy was a young boy, 6 years old, I guess, and he didn't have his head bowed or eyes closed. He saw that snake, and he woke up the whole bowed head congregation by screaming out, "Hey, Unc, look at that snake coming right across the baptism place." Well, that distracted some of the people who were reverently praying. Well, let me tell you about Harv Spears. Harv Spears was a deacon, very faithful, but somehow he didn't get along with Brother Gordon, and I never did find the cause of it. But for some reason, it could have been that when the church voted to go full time, Brother Gordon was pastor at our church and also pastor at well, I can't think of it now, but another church. And we voted to go full time, and I think he was against going full time, and I think that was because of the rift. Brother Gordon, in the deacons meeting, he talked about the fact that some deacons didn't even come to church. Well, and he said, I've got in mind one rared back deacon. Well, that's what he was referring to. He was referring to Harv Spears, because Harv Spears had a big stomach, but he rared back. And Big Leroy got a little bit disturbed because he's in the deacons meeting, and he told Spence and some of the others, he said, I'm pretty rared back myself. He may have been talking about me. But Janie was a precious one. Janie was Harv's wife, and Harv had good fruit trees and always a exemplary garden. Even had a rooster, even had a hen that crowed. That's some people are superstitious, they catch a hen crowing and they make chicken dumplings out of them. But he had a big pile of banana trees, and they grew up 20 feet high. and it was close to his well. He had a well that was on the porch, a big dug well. Right in the porch, you stand on the porch and draw the water, and I thought that was intriguing. And then he would throw water out right beside the porch where these banana trees, and the banana trees got humongous and actually had bunches of bananas on them. And he was free to let us dig up, and it was always easy to get a banana tree to come up. So many people then in Carrera got banana trees. Uh, but he had a plum tree. A plum tree was not like our plum tree. We had a plum tree that never did have very big plums and not all that many, and every one of the plums had a worm in it, almost every one of them. I remember Hezzy Lumpkin would bite into a plum, and the it was evident, that there was a worm in the plum, and he would reach down and pick out the worm and go right on eating the plum. And I was almost horrified. He said, "That plum, worms don't eat much. They don't eat much of the plum." Getting back to Harv and always having a good garden. I remember he didn't have any grass in his garden. I watched him pull up nut grass. That's what I learned about nut grass. Call it nut grass because it has a nut on the end of it, and it sends out shoots and it makes another sprig of grass. We fight it right now. I just pulled up a batch of it at our house, and on this day in August 2001. Buddy was pretty well cared for. He's the only child. He had things we didn't have. He had a rod and reel, first one I'd ever handled, and it was, of course, an open-face reel, and the trick was not to catch fish with it so much as to throw it without it backlashing. When it backlashed, it just tangled and tangled and tangled. And so one of the things I learned was to try to throw the rod and reel with your finger on the reel so it won't go too fast, your thumb, and where it wouldn't backlash. We had a little bridge that Harv had built across the branch right before we got to his house, and we who walked to prayer meeting found it to be a great shortcut. We would pass Howler's store and the sawdust pile and go by Pate Lumpkin's house and make a turn between his house and the Miller house, and then we'd walk across that long wooden walk bridge. And it was, it was a lot of fun, a lot of different things you could figure out walking at night on the bridge. Pate Lumpkin was our supervisor for 20 years. Pete had a bad drinking habit. I suppose we'd call him an alcoholic today, but they called them drunks in those days. And somebody said the difference between a drunk and an alcoholic today is that drunks don't have to go to all their meetings. But he was generous. He was generous to a fault. One of the reasons he always got reelected because he helped people. He helped people two ways. He helped get food for people, and he gave almost anybody a job working on the road. But there's a lot of stories about Pate. Pate's church attendance was timed with how close it was getting to election. Pate would always start coming regular to church a month or so before the election. And he would sober up pretty good during that time. The only time that Pate ever got defeated in running for supervisor was when one of his kinfolk ran against him and split the vote. In addition to that, someone that didn't want him elected came by his store and asked on some excuse for him to ride with him, and he pulled out a fifth of whiskey and tempted Pate, and Pate couldn't resist, and Pate then drunk whiskey until he got so drunk he couldn't stand up, and then this dirty dog that set him up left him in the middle of the widest road that went down by the post office and his store, left him sitting in the road where he couldn't even get up, so all the traffic that came by could see their drunk supervisor. That year he never did sober up, even on election day. I was there, and I watched two men help him stagger in to the voting booth and cast his vote for himself and that one of his relatives. Well, let me continue with my story about our illustrious supervisor, Pate Lumpkin. I believe he was supervisor for 20 years, and I will have to admit that he was a very generous person, and he helped a lot of poor families. In fact, some people say that he opened a store in order to buy votes of the people, and I think really one of his reasons probably to open a store was to be able to provide groceries for people that didn't have money to pay for them. I recall when I surrendered to preach. I remember first time I preached, Pate was there, and as he left the church, he pressed a $5 bill in my hand very secretly as he walked out, and he did that at least one other time. He had a very colorful expression. One of the things that he would respond to, people were always hounding him for paying them for money that they earned on working on the road, and one of his favorite expressions was, "I swear for God, man, I'll pay you Saturday." It was during that last election that this funniest story came out about Pate. They said Pate came in and told his wife, his wife's named Cordelia. He said, "Cordelia, go down there and get that little preacher to come up here and pray for me. I don't feel good." And she said, "Pate, it's drizzling rain out there, and I'm not going to go down there and get the preacher to pray for you. If you need somebody to pray for you, I'll pray for you." So she called on the Lord. She said, "Dear Lord, please strengthen and bless and be with this poor drunk husband." And he said, "Oh, Cordelia, don't tell him I'm drunk. Tell him I'm sick." Let's move on to some other interesting people. We talked about Miss Haller. I'd already said the way Miss Haller dressed. She dressed in a straight skirt, and she had real short hair, just like a man, and she also had a deep voice. These other boys and girls rode on the bus. Sometimes during the noon recess, they'd go down to the store, Tresses or Tom's or Haller's, and buy a pencil or whatever. And one of the boys was saying, "You won't believe it, but I went down there at that little service station store, and they had a man in there that was wearing a skirt." Well, they didn't understand why Pansy was like that. Along that same road, they lived in a big house, and I believe it was right next door to them. Dr. Horn lived in a big house. Dr. Horn had an elevated water tank, and of course he had running water and probably furnished water for the houses around him. He also had a storm cellar. They tell us about cyclone that came through Carrier, and why they called them in those days cyclones instead of tornadoes, I don't know. Dr. Horn was also very generous, and his wife was such a sweet lady. I recall growing up, I had a use of our family shotgun, which was a Ivory Johnson single barrel, 12 gauge. It'd been shot a lot, and the thing that held the barrel secure was very loose, and you'd have to hold your finger to the left to keep it from dangerously coming unbreached while it shot. I recall the very first squirrel hunt, how excited I was. I think I was 12 years old, and I had counted the days, and then I counted the hours before squirrel season. I didn't have a license. I was too young, I think, to get a license, or didn't need one. And so on that first day of squirrel season opened on October 15th. In our part, it opened a little earlier up north, but ours opened on the 15th of October. And I was a law-abiding citizen, wouldn't dare go squirrel hunting before the season opened. Well, I didn't that year. So I got up before daylight, set the alarm clock for about 4, 5 o'clock. Got that shotgun. It was longer than I was, I think. Climbed over the back fence and made my way in the dark down to the branch, same nursery branch I'd mentioned before. And I sat down under a row of trees, and there was unbelievable sounds, and almost all of them were strange sounds, and each sound I thought was a squirrel. So I was there, most of them, of course, some kind of birds. And before it got good daylight, I detected a movement in that tree right above me. And then I saw him. It was a squirrel. And I raised the gun and cocked the hammer and shot, and he fell out. Well, I couldn't find him. I searched a long time, and sure enough, I found him. He was not quite dead, and I chased his trail of blood and found him. On that same morning, I had prayed. I remember praying. I was close to the Lord in those days. I read daily Bible reading both in training union and Sunday school, and then an extra chapter each day. And I had prayed, God, let me kill a squirrel, just one squirrel, and I'll be the happiest boy in Carrier. Well, he did. I killed that squirrel. But the way God answers prayer, and the way God shows his nature, which is so generous and full of blessings, that instead of one, I killed 3. I actually saw that morning 5, but I killed 3. Well, I got home, and my mother helped me dress the 3 squirrels. She had a plan where you cut the skin across the top of the back, and one person got a finger in that place where the skin was cut in the other one, and then they pulled in opposite direction and pulled him out that way. I later learned an easier way to clean squirrels by yourself. But we cleaned those 3 squirrels, and then I went on to school, and I was so proud. I was telling some of the bigger boys, Laverly, Pennon, and some of the others, about me killing 3 squirrels, and none of them had killed 3 squirrels that morning. Then they began to make fun of me. They said, "You're not big enough to hold up a shotgun. You're not about to come here and tell us you killed 3 squirrels this morning." Well, squirrel season was like that for many years. It was much more exciting than Christmas, the first day of squirrel season. I recall before I went squirrel hunting with a gun, I went many times with my brother Arthur, who's, as I mentioned earlier, had acquired the new name of Squeaky. Everyone knew him as Squeaky. His children called him Squeaky. They called him Squeaky in the shipyard in Pascagoula. They called him Squeaky in the Navy, I suppose. Squeaky would, if he came home from Pascagoula, where he worked in the shipyard, he loved to still hunt just like I did. And he would, if he could, he'd get a license. If he couldn't, he'd go without one because he had such limited time, and sometimes he'd go early in the morning before anybody got up. Sometimes they would go without a license. I can recall he would say, Dale, check and see if Brother Lumpkin's car is over at home. Brother Lumpkin was the game warden, and he lived directly across the street from us. And if I looked and didn't see Brother Lumpkin's car, which was a 39 Ford, then they would go over the back fence and go on hunting, thinking, well, the game warden's going somewhere else, we can hunt. I remember we went hunting in Bowley Swamp one time with Squeaky. He let me go along to carry his squirrels, and I recall we killed 2 or 3 that morning, but we also saw, for the first time, I'd never had seen a wild turkey, and we saw wild turkey in the Bowley Swamp that year. Dr. Horn had, this is what got me started on this wild goose chase, was I was talking about the generosity of Dr. Horn. He had both a 12-gauge shotgun and a 22 single-shot rifle, and I don't think he probably ever took time to use them himself, but he was generous with them. I many times borrowed his single-shot rifle, and at that time you could get a box of 22 cartridges, 50 of them, for 50 cents. But that was still a lot of money. But I felt so rich. One Christmas, one of my presents was somebody gave me some money, so I bought a box of 22 cartridges and borrowed that rifle, and went all doing things I ought not have done, is kill birds with that 22 rifle. But one time I borrowed his shotgun, and his shotgun had, the name of it was Long Tom, and it had that name written on it, Long Tom, and the reason it was called Long Tom because it was a 36-inch shotgun, which is, I guess, the longest they made. Some of the shotguns were 28-inch, some of them were 30, but this one was 36. I had shot a squirrel, and he ran in the nest, and it was so high up, he was straight above my head, and I took careful aim and aimed that gun, which was almost straight up, and I shot the nest, and the impact was so tremendous it just about broke my shoulder, because it not only kicked, but it kicked right straight down, and my body was in such a formation it didn't have any give to it. My best squirrel hunting buddy was Ben Crosby. Ben Crosby had a double barrel 12 gauge, his daddy's gun, and it had hammers on the side. I forgot. I'll think about what you call those, but that's what the old ones were like. Later on, they got hammerless, where whenever you re-breeched the gun, you snapped it back in place, it automatically cocked the shotgun, and you didn't see the hammers. Of course, you could shoot one barrel at a time, and they say that one barrel was for long distance and one was shorter. One of them was a full choke, and one of them was a modified choke. Later on, though, Ben acquired a 20-gauge shotgun of his own. He got this from our pastor, who was the greatest pastor I've ever known, Clyde Gordon. He was my mentor and my hero, and Clyde Gordon had this 20 gauge. I don't know how he acquired it during the war. You couldn't buy guns at all. And Ben had a single shot rifle, and he Ben, Clyde Gordon knew how Ben admired his 20 gauge. It was almost new. And so he made the swap. It wasn't an even swap. But anyhow, because of his sensitivity and his kindness, he made the swap. And of course, Ben had a gun that was ahead of the rest of us, and Ben was ahead of the rest of us too when it came to his marksmanship. I recall one day we went hunting on Mill Creek behind Monroe Smith's house. We had to kind of slip in there because if Monroe Smith saw us, he'd start waving his hand. We could see him across the pasture letting us know we weren't supposed to be in there. But in that grove of trees down on Mill Creek where the land actually belonged to Dan Smith, Monroe's daddy, there was some chinkapin trees, and the squirrels like chinkapin. Chinkapin, if you don't know what they are, they're like a wild chestnut. They have kind of a stickery hull, and that opens and it lets out a nut that's real brown, and they fair to eat. They taste a little better than acorns, but squirrels love them. And that's one we had always hoped we'd see a squirrel, and we saw one on that tree and Ben killed him. And on that day, it's the first time I had ever seen it happen. Ben not only would kill a squirrel for every shell, on that day he killed 5 squirrels with 4 shells. And the way he did that, he was aiming at one, and about the time he got him lined up, the 2 of them were playing in I think it was a pin oak tree, and about the time he squeezed off to kill the one, the other one ran right in that direction, and out fell 2 squirrels with one shell. There's a little patch of woods behind Sue Collins, and we'd always come back to that one. And the reason it was good because it was isolated, and the squirrels really, once they were in there, there was hardly anywhere for them to go except round around that little patch of woods. There's a great big squirrel nest, and I climbed up in the tree to, I don't know what I was thinking I was going to find, but when I got up to the squirrel nest and looked in, there was movement, and then there was an old pointed nose possum, a big possum, in that squirrel nest. I don't know what he's doing there, but I slipped on back down the tree, and Ben or I one shot him. I remember biggest game I'd killed was a swamp rabbit that we had. Of course, cottontails, but the swamp rabbits were about maybe 3 times the size, and we came up on one hopping right down the path ahead of us, and I got to shoot him with a shotgun. And all those years that Ben and I hunted, and we hunted everywhere, I did have one notable thing, or one element of notoriety. I was able to kill a fox squirrel. Now, they were very scarce in that part of the country. And Ben recently told me that all the years he'd hunted, he never killed a fox squirrel, and he admired the fact that I had killed a fox squirrel. Let me pause a minute here and get my breath. I had another good buddy through a lot of years, and I've already talked about Hezzy Lumpkin. And Hezzy and I were inseparable when we were younger because we lived just across the road from each other. And we had so many wonderful experiences together. One time we were going to build us a store. Well, we didn't realize the store had to be in a place where there's people. But we thought we'd build it where it's convenient to us. So there's a big grove of pine trees in the edge of his pasture, and we cut down some trees and began to make some kind of crude counter, and somehow got us some Coca-Cola signs, and we were going to go into business, and we were going to serve a whole colony of black people that lived in that area. And But we were just mostly imagining. We never did have any customers. We had thought we had heard about the wealthy black man was named, I don't remember. It seemed like his name was House, but I don't remember. But anyhow, we never did sell anything. Hezzy later on was a proud owner of a little red bicycle. It had pneumatic tires, where the other little green one was hard tired. And I would ride on the back, and he's a pretty good bicyclist. He would carry me, and we'd go just everywhere. Him double heading me, and I'm riding on the back of the. We went to the colony where the black people were, and there was a little store over there, and we just thought it was real neat that we would go and buy a root beer, or we'd go buy a candy bar at this black store. We just thought we were on kind of forbidden ground because we were buying candy or cold drinks at a store, black store. Hezzy had a cousin, Detroit or somewhere, that visited down there, and he was so smart aleck that we didn't like him at all because he thought he knew everything. We were country bumpkins, and he was a city boy and knew so much. But we laughed at his ignorance. One day he was walking out across the field and he got hung up in a briar patch. And everywhere he turned, the more hung up he got. And so he started screaming, and his daddy, Brother Lumpkin, came to his rescue, and he said, "Mister, could you help me? The bushes have got me. The bushes have got me." We thought, how ignorant can a white boy be that don't even know the difference between bushes and a briar patch? One of the few ways that I had of earning any income at all, or we had, was to pick blackberries. First, the thing that came along was dewberries, and along Highway 11 up on some of the banks, they'd come out first. They grew low on the ground, and they would be first, and the dewberries were bigger and sweeter, and so that was the first pick of the blackberry season, was the dewberries. We'd put them in a gallon bucket, a syrup bucket, and at that time the price of a gallon of blackberries was 35 cents. And after picking the gallon, we had to market it. We had to sell it. And so we'd go up and down trying to find somebody who wanted a blackberry cobbler or whatever and give us 35 cents for the blackberries. We're usually successful in selling the blackberries, but if we couldn't sell the blackberries, we had us a backup. Almost without fail, Mrs. Tress, who lived a little distance from the store in that real nice house, she seemed to be always good for a gallon of blackberries. The other sure thing was Professor Powell. He always would buy whatever blackberries we had. I don't know whether it had something to do with his love of children, his gracious spirit. I don't know if he liked blackberries. I wonder what he ever did with all those blackberries. I don't think his wife Stella cooked many blackberry cobblers. And it could have been he just liked boys, but of course our daddy was on the school board for 20 years, and it might have had something to do with that. But he was almost a sure thing if we couldn't sell them somewhere else. This money that I made, I was a very conservative young boy. I saved nearly every nickel. I could save money, in contrast to Ray and some of the others. I didn't get much, but what I got I could hang on to pretty good. Pearson worked at Crosby's nailing shed, and on the second Saturday, every other Saturday, he got a payday, and he gave us all a payday nickel. I remember saving up my money and putting it in a Vic Save jar. I had my whole fortune in a Vicks Ave jar. That couldn't have been all that much money, and some of them were dollar bills, so I had a little bit of money, enough to buy a pair of light blue pants and a checkered blue shirt that just matched. And I didn't have many nice clothes, but when I got that new pair of blue pants and a matching shirt, and Mother ironed it, starched and ironed everything, and I would be a dressed up boy when I went to the movies in Picayune. That's where some of my money went. You could get in the theater for 10 cents, and then you could buy a big bag of popcorn for a nickel. That was a double feature and a newsreel and a serial of Captain Marvel or something else, and a comedy and two movies. So you got a lot for a dime. And if you're hitchhiking, you would stop back by the bus station, and if you had a quarter, you still had a dime left. And I was a sucker for pinball machines. In fact, Ben and Preston and I suppose you would say we were addicted to playing the pinball machine. That was before they had flippers. Ben and Preston went somewhere to play a basketball game, came back. I think he had been to Summerall, and they had a flipper pinball machine, and he described it for me. We played the pinball machine at Holcomb service station. Number of summers when Bennon lived right across the highway from Holcomb service station. We played the pinball machine unceasingly, and we were not above fudging a little bit. One of the things we did was lift the pinball machine and put it on our toes, and that made the ball roll a lot slower, and sometime it would get hung up when it came through a place, and it would just keep on rolling up the score until you could hear that click, click, click when you got some free games. Some of the other roughhouse boys would kick the bottom of the pinball machine, and it would give them a free game. Miss Holcomb got fed up with Ben and Preston and I could imagine now how the reason she did get fed up on us. We was always under her feet. We were always banging on the pinball machine, and she said she lost her temper one day, and she said, "You boys are nothing but public nuisance." And we had that title that we used on each other for a lot of years. You're nothing but a public nuisance. I'm going to stop now. I can remember the smells on the first day of school. In the old building, we had floors that weren't painted, but they did mop them down good with oil, I guess to keep the dust down or maybe to clean them. So you'd have that smell of new oil on the floor, and everyone had new pencils, and as they sharpened their pencils, there was a lot of smell of cedar shavings, and the Holloway boys weren't the only ones that had new overalls, and so there was a very strong smell of denim cloth overalls. So that was all blended together, and that's a memory of the smells of starting back to school. In the new building, the building we moved into in the middle of my first grade year, I had spent another half a year in the old building in what we called primer. Now, in this new building, we had new floors, and of course they were sanded and varnished and real slick, and students liked to run down the hall and slide. Sometime you'd be, if you weren't careful, you'd slip down. In that new building, our second grade teacher was named Miss Stella Powell. She was our principal's wife. She was a very good teacher, and she had smiling eyes, and she also had a Victrola. and she was the only one in the school that had a Victrola. And so some of the other rooms, the other grades would come in, and we'd have a little program, and she would play as we listened to those Victrola records, like There Ain't No Flies on Me, and The Wreck of the Old 97. Uh, I recall in the second grade, even though we were in the new building, sometime we'd go back to the old building, put on a chapel program. Different grades would be responsible for some of the programs. We learned to sing Billy Boy, and we were all lined up ready to go to sing for all the school, Billy Boy. And she said, now children, if you forget the words, you just listen to Dale. He knows the words, and he will be the one singing louder than all the rest. It must have been about the time that I thought my choice of a career would be singing. For some reason, I was mistaken in thinking I was a singer just because I sang loud. I still like to sing, and I like to sing loud. I saw a cartoon and my wife is so pleased to think about, or got such a charge out of. It was a picture of the preacher sitting in the preacher's chair and the song director trying to lead, and the caption was, behind every music director there's a preacher singing loud, off key, and that kind of fit me. I remember another program we had, a Halloween program, and they dressed me up in some kind of a red elf suit that kind of resembled long barrels, but it was made out of a little better material. My part was to sing with them the song Halloween, Oh Halloween. The song had a good many verses, and I must have been in the primary or first grade, and when they got to the chorus, I knew the chorus, and the chorus words were Halloween, oh Halloween. I drowned them all out, and one was sniggering. I could hear them, and years went by, and still in Pate's store or in the school or the church, somebody would look at me and say, Dale, sing for us. Sing that song, Halloween, oh Halloween. I had a very traumatic time when I was about 3 years old. Our next door neighbor was Juanita and Holly Stockstill. And I thought Juanita was so beautiful. She had red hair, and she was so kind and warm. And so I told the brothers and sisters that Juanita was my girlfriend. I was 3 years old, and they kidded me about how Hollis was going to have to give me a switching because I was trying to steal his wife. I didn't know any better. I was there to visit Juanita one afternoon, and I kept knocking on the door. No one came to the door. And about that time, a car drove up. I didn't know the big man that got out of the car. He came walking up the steps, and he said, son, what are you doing here? And I said, oh, I just came to see Miss Juanita. And he looked at me with a mean expression, and he said, boy, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut you up into little pieces and put you in a flour sack and drag you down the road. Well, somehow I managed to dash around him. Well, it just took me about 2 minutes to get into my yard and into my mother's arms. I always had a horror when he was around. He would sometimes stop by when I was there, or I'd see him somewhere in his car, and it always frightened me to death to see him. Until he came one time to our house, and I was sitting in my daddy's lap, and there was no fear while I was in my daddy's lap. In fact, I could have spit in Roscoe Lumpkin's eye while I was safe in my daddy's lap. I remember a dream I used to have. It was a recurring dream through many years. The dream was I would come back home and go down our long driveway and go up the steps and find another family had moved in to our house. And I'd say, "Where's Mama?" And they'd say, "We don't know your Mama." And I'd say, "Well, where's Bedloo and where's Ray and where's Squeaky?" And we don't know any of those people. We live here. We don't want you here. Well, I didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. And then I'd see my daddy walking down the road, down, turning in our driveway. And then everything's all right when I saw Daddy. Our daddy was a master carpenter. I remember how many houses he built. He built many churches and schools. There was a Jewish couple that owned the Boston store in Picayune. It was the best clothing store. It was out on Canal Street. And they came to our house on one Sunday afternoon. They wanted to talk to Daddy about doing some carpenter work in their store. And the wife said, "We know that not only are you..." It was Miss Carp. The wife was named Miss Carp. They were a Jewish couple. She said, "Not only do we know that you're the best carpenter in Pearl River County, but you're the best carpenter in the South." My dad was real impressed by that compliment. He was thinking that's a pretty high compliment to be the best carpenter in the South. I remember Daddy worked so hard. In the hot summertime during the war, we for some reason couldn't get buttons, regular buttons, plastic buttons. So they made buttons out of cardboard. And the sweat would get so heavy on Daddy's shirt it would melt those cardboard buttons. I remember I'd meet him when he came in from work. He took his lunch. Mother got up, got him off to work every morning, fixed a lunch for him. And I was, of course, greeting him, but I was trying to get my hand on that lunchbox. Because quite often there would be half of a sandwich or maybe even an apple that was left. And I was so delighted that I could finish his lunch. I thought about that. I think probably sometimes he left something in his lunchbox knowing that I'd be getting the treat when he got home. Betty Lou and I would often be out under the oak trees playing hopscotch, and some of the other children lolling around. But I could remember her calling out to us, "Children, get busy doing something, bringing in the wood or some other work, 'cause it's time for your daddy to come home." I know as hard as he worked, she thought it would encourage him to see the children working too. We had a few chores. I got by not milking because, well, I just let them know I never did learn how to milk, so I can't milk. Sometime I'd be a substitute, and I couldn't quite get the bucket full. I remember we had two cows. One was named Baby, and I forgot what the other one's name. Baby was the best milk cow we had. She gave about 2.5 gallons at each milking with a lot of cream. She was a Jersey. The one day that I was given the responsibility to go out and milk, I was so proud. I had the milk up to the first rim, which was about three-fourths full. And baby, who always, when the feed got low, she began to step around. When she still had plenty, she wanted you to know it's time to put her another batch of feed in. I didn't pay her much mind. I was trying to finish up, and she stepped around and stepped right in the middle of my bucket of milk that I had worked so hard on. And I confess now, I don't know if I ever told. I took the milk stool and broke it across her rear end. The We didn't have too many medical or dental bills. I recall that Dr. Horn delivered, I suppose, all of us or nearly all of us, and some of the news that I understood about the pay he received for delivering the baby was $25. And they used to kid me. Dr. Horn would deliver the birth certificate or have it filled out and sent to records after you paid the $25. So they were trying to tell me that I wasn't even paid for, that you're not even paid for. Well, I found in Daddy's trunk where he kept imported papers in a cigar box, at the bottom of the trunk, a birth certificate with my name on it. And I gladly paraded that birth certificate and said to all the brothers and sisters that, listen, I am paid for. Here it is, my birth certificate. We would be taken to the doctor if it was serious. And I recall Mother stepped on a rusty nail, either in the hog pen or near the hog pen. And that, no doubt, was what caused her to have diphtheria. Diphtheria was a terrible disease, and sometimes it was fatal. Dr. Horn gave her some kind of powerful shot, and finally her foot healed. The dentist was a place I never did go to until I guess I was 11 years old, but I remember Betty Lou had to go to the dentist. I think she was 5, maybe 6. And she was so frightened. We had just got our payday. Pearson worked for Crosby and got paid every 2 weeks. And he always gave us a payday nickel. So she had that payday nickel in her hand, and she tearfully told Mother. She pressed that nickel into Mother's hand, and she said, Mama, I want you to have my nickel in case I don't live through this experience. I remember another time Betty Lou lost her payday nickel. And she cried, and she looked, and she cried, and she looked, and I helped her look. We finally found the penny. We finally found the nickel. All the time she was looking for it. It was in her hand. And you know, a lot of times we're so sad about what we don't have, and we don't realize it's right in our grasp. My dentist trip was one cold morning. Ray and I hitchhiked to the dentist, well, to Picayune, and he pulled a tooth. Well, that's about all we went to the dentist for, to pull teeth. And I was of the impression, no problem, because when you get into your 50s, you have to have them all pulled so you get false teeth, like my mother and daddy had lowers and uppers. On the way back, we hitchhiked and we got a ride with Boaz Jones. He was a well digger for the whole area. And he asked us, where you boys been? He said, well, we've been to Ray said, I took Dale to the dentist. And he said, well, it's a mighty cool morning. He said, I guess it's a good morning to get your tooth pulled. It'd be a good morning to kill hogs. Now let me see how that tooth got to the place it needed to be pulled. Boys do crazy things. God has to work overtime to take care of fools and children. It's a wonder boys ever live to grow up. We had no better sense than to get shoes up sides on a Sunday afternoon between Tress's store and Mill Creek Bridge. We were fighting with slingshots, shooting each other with slingshots. Well, everything went well. I remember someone hit R.J. Pennon right in the belly, and he was squealing and hollering, and we were hoorah on our side. We were laughing. I had my mouth wide open, laughing about R.J. getting hit in the belly with a rock. And while I had my mouth open laughing, someone hit me in that open mouth with a rock and broke off one tooth and cracked one half in two. Well, I suffered with that broken tooth a long time till it got so bad I had to go to the dentist that day and have both parts of it pulled. We usually enjoyed a swing in one of the trees. I remember getting a big rope from Hollis. I guess it was used to tow heavy equipment. It was almost big around as your arm. And it was long enough, it looked like, to me to make the swing of all swings. So I climbed the